Okay, good afternoon. Today is Veterans Day, but it wasn't always Veterans Day. It was Armistice Day because of November 11th, 1918, the Armistice, which ended World War I. So they said World War II on there. It was World War I. And we're going to go back to 1918, and we're going to go back, talk about Armistice Day and how Armistice Day came to be and other things that happened in 1918. World War I rages on. For those of you who are taking the SATs, you better know this. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. You'll get extra credit on the SATs if you can name all 14 of them. The Doughboy from 1918, the American soldier, the Yanks, the Doughboy. And there were other American soldiers like the Harlem Hellcats. Babe Ruth becomes Babe Ruth in 1918 in terms of being a pitcher. The Babe, patriotism, and the World Series. And you're going to say, how does all that fit together? But it does. Patriotism, the war, and the Babe. Armistice Day does take place on November 11th, and that's Times Square on November 11th. The Spanish flu, that comes to be in 1918. One step closer to Prohibition. Prohibition Amendment is going around the country and people are voting whether or not to be wet, which meant you could drink, or dry, which meant we're going to take alcohol away from you. The women fight, or the women's fight to vote, continues. This is a woman in Washington protest. Kaiser Wilson, referring to President Woodrow Wilson. Have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they weren't self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. Take the beam out of your eye. Women want to vote, and women want rights. And the struggle continues to this day. Tsar Nicholas II is killed, and if you have one of these postage stamps, and there are only about 100 of them available, if you have one of them, you're a millionaire if you own one of them. How many of you like Tarzan? Tarzan. Tarzan makes his film debut in 1918. Tarzan the picture starts in 1918. But we start with World War I, and the beginning of World War I is really in 1914 on June 30th when the Archduke Ferdinand, Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is killed in Sarajevo. He was the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He and his wife were assassinated by gunmen during a drive-through in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. He ignored warnings that Serbian terrorists linked to a group called the Black Hand, still upset from Austria's annexation of that area in 1908, was plotting to assassinate him during his state visit to Sarajevo. The day of his tour was Serbian National Day. And his wife Sophie said, don't go, don't go, whatever you do, don't go, don't go. We'll go there another time. It's pretty nice in the winter. I hear that the Winter Olympics may be there one day. It's really nice, but who's going to hurt me? I'm Archduke Ferdinand. Nobody's going to come after me. But the assassination was traced to a Serbian extremist group that wanted to increase Serbian power in the Balkans by breaking up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Anybody who has family or had family that came from there? You did?
I came from there.
You came from there. So what year?
From Austria.
From Austria. But that was after they broke up, obviously. World War I was also known as the Great War. Starts on July 28, 1914. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and the peace between Europeans' great powers quickly collapsed. Within a week, Russia, Belgium, France, Great Britain, and Serbia had lined up against Austria-Hungary and Germany, and World War I, known as the Great War, began. Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia in response. Germany supported Austria-Hungary, and Russia sided with its traditional ally, Serbia. Meanwhile, in the United States, the President of the United States is Woodrow Wilson, and he is watching. He is determined not to let America get involved in this great war. Well, that's his determination. And at first, he's sitting on the sidelines. At the outbreak of the fighting, the United States remained on the sidelines, adopting a policy of neutrality favored by Wilson, while continuing to engage in commerce and shipping with European countries on both sides of the conflict. The United States did not want to give up money, so they stayed neutral so they could trade with both sides. On August 4th, Wilson declared that the United States would remain impartial in thought as well as in action. But America gets sucked into the war eventually, starting with the sinking of the Lusitania. It is 1915, and Germany declared that the waters surrounding the British Isles be a war zone. German U-boats sunk several commercial and passenger vehicles, including U.S. ships. Now, I did give talks on cruise ships before COVID, and one of the cruise ships that I gave a talk on was Holland America. Anybody ever go on the Holland America lines? You have, okay. Well, there was a Holland America historian on the ship talking about the history of the company, including their roles in World War I and World War II, and also in immigration. For purposes here, I'm just going to talk about World War I. Yes, there were munitions on these ships, these passenger ships. And because there were munitions on these ships were fair game. They were absolute fair game. Did the people know that there were munitions on the ship? No, they didn't know that. But Holland America, along with other companies, carried all kind of weaponry against the Central Powers, rather against the Austro-Hungary Germany axis. Anyway, widespread protests over the sinking of a U-boat of the British ocean liner Lusitania, traveling from New York to Liverpool, England, with hundreds of American passengers on board on May 7th, 1915, begins to turn the Americans against Germany, and maybe we should enter the war. There is another ship that's torpedoed. It's called the U.S. Arabic, rather the SS Arabic. It's August 19, 1915, when Germany sunk a British ocean liner. And so it was in self-defense. There were munitions on that ship. The event further strained diplomatic relations between the United States and Germany. President Woodrow Wilson warned Germany that if it was determined they sunk the ship without cause, the United States may cut off diplomatic ties with Germany. Germany caved and in September announced that they would no longer sink passenger ships without warning. Satisfied, at least for the moment, Wilson chose not to declare war on Germany despite being encouraged by others, including members of his cabinet. Meanwhile, World War I is disintegrating. Is that a word to use? It's a stalemate. Nothing is going on. Germans, nothing's going on. The Brits, the French, Italians, nothing's going on. It's trench warfare, inch by inch by inch by inch by inch. The war on the Western Front became one of attrition by 1917. The French army was exhausted, and they bore the brunt of the Allied effort and the trauma of Verdun. The British began suffering manpower shortages, having increasingly taken over from the French in 1917. German army was weakened, despite being able to concentrate entirely on the Western Front after the defeat of Russia over on the Eastern Front. But the German manpower was rapidly diminishing, and its ally, Austria-Hungary, was crumbling. Now, if you saw this close, it doesn't matter if you see it from back there or if you saw this close. This is a Western Union telegram, and I am going to read you the contents of this telegram. 1:30, 1:30:42, 13:401, 850. You're not going to make heads or tails out of that. But it is a telegram that went through the United States from Germany to Mexico. It's called the Zimmerman Telegram. And basically, the code's broken by the Brits, and the Germans are asking Mexico, and Mexico was in an upheaval at that time, join us, come to our side. The Zimmerman Telegram, which said basically, while the British intelligence in January 1917 intercepted this telegram from the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German Minister to Mexico, Heinrich von Eckhardt. The Zimmerman Telegram stated that Germany planned to return to unrestricted submarine warfare and would sink all ships, including those carrying American passengers, located in the war zone. The telegram also proposed an alliance between Germany and Mexico should the United States join the European allies. On April 6, 1917, Congress voted to declare war on Germany. Wilson had asked Congress for a war to end all wars that would make the world safe for democracy. Woodrow Wilson, hand in the bucket, pulling out the year or the birthday of somebody as they scrambled to put this draft together back in 1917. On May 18, 1917, U.S. Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which authorized the federal government to temporarily expand the military through conscription. The act eventually required all men between the ages of 21 and 45 to register for military service. Under the act, 24 million men registered for the draft. Of the total troops sent to Europe by the U.S., 2.8 million had been drafted, another 2 million had volunteered. Next, the doughboy. It's not the Pillsbury doughboy. That is the doughboy of World War I. And I'm going to ask you a question. Any of your parents, grandparents, or other relatives served in World War I that you know of? Anybody?
Father.
Yeah, yeah.
My father.
Your father. So it's Veterans Day / Armistice Day for him. So if he's your father. So anyway, they were doughboys. That's the name they liked, doughboys or Yanks. The doughboy was a popular nickname for the American infantrymen during World War I. The Great War marked the first time in history that the United States sent soldiers abroad to defend foreign soil. The French ecstatically welcomed the first wave of soldiers. Viva la America. Now, everybody had to go. Even if you were the mayor of New York City, if you were drafted, you went into the military service. Important people were drafted. This is in Central Park, this little plaque. Mayor of the City of New York, 1914 to 1918, born July 19th, 1879, died in the service of the United States July 6, 1918, in memory of John Heroy Mitchell, who happened to be the mayor of New York City when he was called up for the draft and went over and gave up his life. Even the mayor of New York City was not exempt. Yanks, Sammies, Pershings, Crusaders, just some of the names used to label American enlisted men in World War I. Pershings, Crusaders, and Sammies for Uncle Sam's troops made some appearances in advertising and in propaganda posters, but those labels were not well liked by the troops, many of whom prefer to be called Yanks. More than 4 million men, along with support from non-military personnel, were needed for the war. By November 17, 1917, the Americans were on the battlefield. And there was a song, and everybody in this room knows this song. Over there. Over there. The Yanks are coming. It won't be over until it's over there. George M. Cohan. George M. Cohan wrote Over There after he learned that the U.S. abandoned their policy of non-intervention and planned to enter World War I on the side of the Allied powers. Over There was the greatest of all of the wartime propaganda songs during this period. It was made famous by the singer Nora Bayes, who was a famous vaudevillian actress and singer, who in 1908 popularized a song called Take Me Out to the Ballgame. Ever hear that one? And also co-wrote with her then husband, Jack Norwood, a song that you probably heard of. Shine on Harvest Moon? Yeah, that was Nora Bayes. And there were other songs such as Oh, How I Hate to Get Up in the Morning, Irving Berlin. Anybody here not ever hear that song? Irving Berlin. Over there, Don't Send My Darling Boy Away were two popular songs. It was the anti-German Bing Bang Bingham on the Rhine. Also, other songs depicting the everyday life of soldiers, such as Oh, How I Hate to Get Up in the Morning, and I Don't Want to Get Well, a duet by Arthur Fields and Grace Woods. There were also African Americans who fought in World War I, initially for France and then for the United States. Colored soldiers, the Colored Soldier Boys of Uncle Sam, were coming, dedicated to the colored soldiers of the USA, words and music W.J. Nickerson, and the music sheet comes out of New Orleans. African Americans had participated in every military conflict since the inception of the United States. They enlisted and prepared for involvement. However, most of those who enlisted were drafted found themselves in just a support role. Many African Americans served under the Services of Supply section of the American Expeditionary Force. This section comprised of stevedore, labor, engineering services for battalions and companies. The main function of these companies to support and provide materials to other companies along the front. The notable exception were the soldiers who fought in the front lines, and they were the 92nd and 93rd Infantry Divisions. The 369th Colored Soldiers Infantry Regiment, also known as the Harlem Hellfighters, were assigned to the French Army in April. In this post, the Hellfighters saw much action fighting in the Second Battle of Marne, as well as the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. For their valiant and brave actions during World War I, or for his, Private Henry Johnson of the 369th became the first American to receive the War Cross. An additional 170 members of the 369th also got the French medal. Well, there was a problem in the United States, and the problem was Woodrow Wilson, and he decided to trample on the Constitution, big time. You said anything against the war, you could be arrested under the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act had been signed. On May 16th, the U.S. Congress passes the Sedition Act. Along with the Espionage Act of the previous year, the Sedition Act was orchestrated largely by A. Mitchell Palmer, the United States Attorney General under Woodrow Wilson. The Espionage Act passed shortly after the U.S. entrance into World War I in early April 1917. Made it a crime for any person to convey information intended to interfere with our U.S. armed forces and their prosecution of the war effort, or to promote the success of the country's enemies. Aimed at socialists, pacifists, and other anti-war activists, the Sedition Act imposed harsh penalties on anyone found guilty of making false statements that interfered with the prosecution of the war, insulting or abusing the U.S. government, the flag, the Constitution, or the military, agitating against the production of necessary war materials, or advocating, teaching, or defending any of these actions. And this is a propaganda poster, and this is a guy getting caught in a spider web. Don't talk, the web is spun for you with invisible threads. Keep out of it, help destroy it, stop, think, ask yourself, what if you were about to say something that might help the enemy? Spies are listening. Those found guilty of violating either the Espionage Act or the Sedition Act shall be punished by a fine of no more than $10,000, $209,000 today, or imprisonment for not more than 20 years, or both. This was the same penalty that had been imposed for acts of espionage in earlier legislation. Eugene V. Debs, socialist, ran for president a number of times, including running for president from jail in 1920. But why was he in jail? Well, he was arrested in 1918. One of the most famous prosecutions under the Sedition Act during World War I was that of Eugene V. Debs, a pacifist labor organizer, founder of the Industrial Workers of America, or rather Industrial Workers of the World, who had run for president as a social democrat in 1900, 1904, 1908, 1912 on the Socialist Party ticket. After delivering an anti-war speech on June 16, 1918 in Canton, Ohio, Debs was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 10 years in prison under the Sedition Act. Sports takes a back seat. No big deal sports in 1917. Not like it is today, which is just a multi-billion-dollar industry. Basically, if you're an able-bodied athlete, you're going off to the Army, with the exception of Jack Dempsey. There was an exemption. If you were the sole breadwinner of your family, you didn't have to go over there. Jack Dempsey, the boxer, said he was the sole breadwinner. And after that, kind of took on the Muhammad Ali personality in that he was considered a draft dodger. But most of the athletes who were asked to go in the draft, all of them went, with the exception of Dempsey. In the United States, most professional sports teams shut down during the World War I. Athletic men were needed for the war effort. Work or fight orders compelled professional athletes to join the military. Public opinion turned against athletes who chose to stay in the United States and play ball rather than join their fellow countrymen in combat. On June 1st, 1917, the Boston Braves catcher, Hank Gowdy, became the first baseball player to enlist in the military. Baseball was non-essential, so was boxing. There was a little basketball here or there, but very little. Track and field. The Army General Enoch Crowther convinced Newton Baker, the United States Secretary of War, that any draft-eligible men employed in non-essential jobs should be forced to choose: enlist to help stateside or risk going to the front lines of Europe. And look who's playing baseball. Look who's playing baseball. It's Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam is playing baseball. Get into the game. That is the poster. That is what it is called. Get into the game. Become patriotic. So Uncle Sam, well, while he's a baseball player, is telling you, you know what, you can play baseball another time. You got to get to the game to help the war effort. The Committee on Public Information was created by Woodrow Wilson to promote patriotism. Question, anybody sing the Star-Spangled Banner today? I see all the flags all around. Anybody get up to sing the Star-Spangled Banner? Nobody. It was not the national anthem in 1917, nor was it in 1918. But the Star-Spangled Banner was performed as early as 1897, opening day ceremonies at a baseball game in Philadelphia. And the polo grounds, anybody go to the polo grounds back in the day? You did. Well, beginning in 1898, the song was played before New York Giants games. Professional baseball had become under scrutiny when both the American League and National League decided, let's suspend the 1918 season. The 1918 World Series was held in early September because of World War I's worker fight order, and that forced the premature end of the regular season on September 2nd. But the Star-Spangled Banner becomes a big deal because of the 1918 World Series. Wilson's ploy of patriotism had worked somewhat. U.S. military band was on hand, Game 1 of the World Series in Chicago. It's the Cubs playing the Red Sox. And during the 7th inning stretch, that Thursday evening, it played an impromptu rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner. It was a patriotic song. Oddly enough, when you look at the history of the Star-Spangled Banner and the national anthem, Chicago Cubs games, the last place that it was played after everybody else played it was in Chicago. They held out to the very end and finally started playing the national anthem before baseball games. Oh, Star Spangled Banner, which is a terrible song to sing, because my wife has sung that, is a patriotic song, or becomes one. Meanwhile, Babe Ruth emerges. Nobody knows that Babe Ruth is going to become Babe Ruth, but he becomes Babe Ruth starting in 1918. He wins 2 games in the World Series as a pitcher, and he's both a pitcher and an everyday player during the season. The Red Sox won the World Series, beating Chicago 4-2. Babe Ruth not only pitched, and he also set a record for most consecutive scoreless innings in this World Series. He won 13 games, and he also batted .300 and led the league with 11 home runs. Now, about 9 days ago, you had to change the clock. How many of you enjoyed changing the clock? You had to put the clock back about 9 days ago. Remember that? Well, it's because of World War I that you pushed the clock back an hour in the fall, and you put the clock ahead 1 hour in the spring. The Standard Time Act of 1918, also known as the Calder Act, established a standard time in the United States, and it was to be divided into 5 time zones. The 5 time zones, the Atlantic, which is Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Eastern, Central, Mountain West, and the Alaska-Hawaiian time zone. And it was created by the Interstate Commerce Commission in concurrence with zones previously established by the National Railroad System. It dictated that on the last Sunday of March, each clock would be advanced an hour forward, and that you got back the hour on the last Sunday in October, and it was all done in an effort to save fuel, which was needed for the troops in Europe. Now, this is the SAT part of this talk. Pay attention. I'll be asking questions later. The 14 points. Woodrow Wilson lays out a plan for peace, peace forever, in January of 1918. Open diplomacy without secrets, economic free trade on the seas during war and peace, equal trade conditions, decrease armaments among all nations, adjust colonial claims, evacuation of all Central Powers, that would be Austria, Hungary, Germany, from Russia, and allow it to define its own independence. Remember, in 1917, there is the Bolshevik Revolution. Belgium to be evacuated and restored. Me and my wife in Montenegro, back about 10 years ago. The 14 points, Montenegro comes into this in a second. The return of the Alsace-Lorraine region in all French territories. Readjust Italian borders. Austria-Hungary to be provided an opportunity for self-determination. Redraw the borders of the Baltic region, creating Romania, Serbia, Montenegro. Creation of a Turkish state with guaranteed free trade in the Dardanelles. Creation of an independent Polish state, and the creation of the League of Nations. That will come back in a couple of months. This is Kaiserschlacht, the last stand by Germany, the absolute last stand. The beginning of 1918, as the winter ended, the German army decided to launch a major offensive with the goal of pushing the Allies back and winning the war. The German Spring Offensive, also known as Kaiserschlacht, or the Kaiser's Battle, was launched on March 21st. The German army made significant advances into France, however, despite this, suffered very heavy casualties. The offensive stalled by July due to the lack of new soldiers and limited supplies from Germany. The Second Battle of Marne, the beginning of the end. On July 15th, near the Marne River in the Champagne region of France, the Germans begin what would be their final offensive push of World War I. Dubbed the Second Battle of Marne, the conflict ended several days later. The Allies had a major victory. The Germans approached the real front line here, and they were trapped with a fierce barrage of American and French fire. Trapped and surrounded, the Germans suffered heavy casualties, setting up the Allies for a major counteroffensive, which would start on July 18th. The 100 days offensive. The Allies decide, let's end it. Let's end it as quickly as we can. The 100 days offensive was a major offensive launched by the Allies in August. The goal of this offensive was to push back the Germans and retake control of ground that had been lost earlier in the war. The Battle of the Hindenburg Line was fought between September 17th and October 15th as part of the 100 Days Offensive. The Hindenburg Line was one of the last defensive structures held by the German army. 3 waves of attack were required by the Allied forces to finally break through the defenses. Each wave relied upon heavy artillery and bombardment, followed by infantry advances, which were supported by tanks and aircraft. At the end of each wave, the Germans had suffered 4 times the casualties compared to the Allies. And this guy knows it's all done. His name is General Ludendorff. He's from Germany, and he realizes it's done. There's no way we can win. In the fall, Germany and its allies were exhausted. Their armies were defeated, and their hungry citizens in the countries began to rebel. As early as September 29th, the German general and strategist Erich von Ludendorff decided, we got to end this. We have to end this. The German government goes up to the Wilson administration and says, it's over. It's over. But as Yogi Berra once said, ain't over until it's over. Germany asked peace on Wilson's 14 points, the 14 points that came out in January. They hoped that the peace would be based on the 14 points laid out by Wilson as the foundation for peace without victory. By October, the German troops were engaged in the Western Front, and the Americans knew that they had the Germans on the run, so they were not going to help them out any way, shape, or form. This guy is Ferdinand Foch, and he is the guy who was responsible for Armistice Day, which now, on November 11th, 2024, is known as Veterans Day. And as I walked in here, I saw the flags and the Veterans Day celebration. The armistice negotiations were not conducted by the Allied governments, the the United States, England, France, and Italy, but by their commander-in-chief, Ferdinand Foch. He ensured that conditions made it impossible for the German army to begin fighting again. Having the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II, or third, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and the formation of a democratic government in Germany were necessary adjuncts to the armistice. The generals ensured that the new socialist government was tarnished with the humiliation of defeat for which they themselves were responsible. This is Greece, Armistice of Mudras. The Ottoman Empire and the Allies signed the Armistice of Mudras on October 30th. The signing took place on board the HMS Agamemnon and in the port of Mudras, the Greek island of Lemnos. The terms of the agreement included letting the Allies take control of the Straits of Dardanelles and the Bosporus, and having the Ottoman Empire surrender all of its garrisons outside the Anatolia region of modern-day Turkey. The agreement effectively put an end to fighting in the Middle East during World War I. Meanwhile, Germany was forced to ask for an armistice. The conditions were dictated by Foch in the name of the Allies on November 11th, 1918, which is how we get to Armistice Day. The armistice of November 11th, 1918 was an armistice ending the land, sea, and air fighting in World War I between the Allied nations in Germany. Although previous armistices eliminated Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this one marked the victory for the Allies and the complete defeat of Germany. But there was no formal surrender. This is what it looked like in New York 106 years ago today. It's 106 years ago today. This is what happened. The war is over. It's over there. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, The war to end all wars ended with an armistice. But the war really didn't end totally. Hostilities ceased, but treaties need to have been signed. And they were not signed on November 11th. The actual terms of the armistice, mostly written by the Allied Supreme Commander Marshal Ferdinand Foch, included cessation of hostilities, withdrawal of German troops to behind the Rhine River, Allied occupation of the Rhineland and bridgeheads further east, the keeping the infrastructure together, the surrendering of aircraft, warships, and military material, the release of Allied prisoners of war and interned civilians, and eventual reparations. But for Germany, no release of German prisoners of war, no relaxation of the blockade of Germany was agreed to by this time. These are the guys who died in the trenches. And there were a lot of casualties, an awful lot of casualties during World War I. The total number of military and civilian casualties in World War I was around 40 million people. There were 20 million deaths and 21 million wounded in terms of the military. The number of deaths included 9.7 million military personnel and about 10 million civilians. The Allies lost about 5.7 million soldiers. Central Powers lost about 4 million soldiers. They were dying in the trenches. Well, got to get a peace now. You have Armistice Day, you have the end of the war, but there's nothing permanent. There's nothing saying that this war can't bubble up again. Woodrow Wilson goes to Paris in December of 1918 to work on getting the peace. It's December 13th, and he's in France to start peace negotiations and promote his plan for the League of Nations, an international organization that would resolve conflicts between nations. But if the war wasn't bad enough, the Spanish flu was deadlier than World War I. I had two great uncles who died 1919, 1920 from the Spanish flu, which probably originated in the United States, not in Spain. The flu emerged in two phases. In the late spring, the first phase, known as the 3-day fever, appeared without warning. Few deaths were reported. Victims recovered after a few days. But then it comes. When the disease surfaced again in the fall, it was far more severe. Scientists, doctors, and health officials could not identify this disease, which was striking so fast and viciously, eluding treatment and defying control. Some victims died within hours of their first symptoms. Others succumbed a few days later. Their lungs filled with fluid, they suffocated to death. Despite its name, researchers believe the Spanish flu most likely originated in the United States. One of the first recorded cases, March 11th, Fort Riley in Kansas. Overcrowding and unsanitary conditions created a fertile breeding ground for the virus. Within a week, 522 men had been admitted to camp hospitals suffering from the same influenza. People are dying. Somebody is being taken away after they died. Spanish flu was deadly. Soon after, the Army reported similar outbreaks in Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and California. Navy ships docked at East Coast ports also reported outbreaks of severe influenza and pneumonia among their crews. The flu seemed to target military personnel, not civilians, so the virus was largely overshadowed by the current hot issues: prohibition, women's rights movement, and also getting the vote, immigration, and the bloody battles in Europe. In the spring, it appeared that America's involvement in the fight against Germany was beginning to make a difference. In March, 84,000 doughboys set out for Europe. They were followed by another 118,000 the next month. Little did they know that they were carrying with them a disease that would prove more deadly than the rifles that they were carrying. While sailing across the Atlantic, the 15th U.S. Cavalry incurred 36 cases of influenza, 6 died. By May, the killer flu had established itself on 2 continents and was growing. And this is a hospital ward with the guys who have the flu. The influenza of 1918 showed no bias in its approach to the combatants in World War I, as men from both sides were sickened and killed. Great Britain reported 31,000 influenza cases in June alone. The flu was such a leveler of men that war plans had to be altered. Attacks that had been painstakingly planned had to be postponed because there was a shortage of healthy men. By early summer, the flu reached beyond the U.S., beyond Western Europe. Numerous cases of influenza were reported in Russia, North Africa, and India. The Pacific Ocean provided no protection as the influenza bug spread to parts of China, Japan, the Philippines, and to New Zealand. By July, the influenza had left its mark globally. Tens of thousands had fallen ill and died. And with the pandemic came closures and mask ordinances. Closed until further notice, all theaters at the request of the mayor. Health experts cannot pinpoint exactly where the virus first took hold. There are conflicting reports, but it is generally agreed that the spread through World War I military troop movements was the cause. Truth is, the pandemic became associated with Spain because it was the first country to openly talk about it. Spain was neutral during World War I, didn't censor its news. Therefore, Spanish news sources reported the results of the devastating disease that was sickening and killing people. The spread of the Spanish flu was slowed by identifying suspicious cases through surveillance and voluntary or enforced quarantine or isolation. Does this sound familiar, by the way? Yeah. History repeats itself, constantly repeats itself. Because no vaccinations or antivirals were available at the time, public health officials thought the only effective weapons against the disease was isolating people and wearing a mask. And masks as protection. This is going through Manhattan, the troops. And if you notice, all the troops have a mask on. They all have a mask on. In the United States, local governments rolled out initiatives to try and stop its spread. These varied by region and included closing schools and places of public amusement, enforcing no spitting ordinances, encouraging people to use handkerchiefs or disposable tissues, or requiring people to wear masks in public. Mask-wearing ordinances popped up in the western states. And it appears most people did comply with them. The nation was still fighting World War I, and officials framed the anti-flu measures, such as wearing a mask, as a way to protect the troops from deadly outbreaks. This is a football game. Georgia Tech is playing football, and you notice everybody in the stands, they're all wearing masks. By fall, 7 cities: San Francisco, Seattle, Oakland, Sacramento, Denver, Indianapolis, and Pasadena, California, put mandatory face mask laws into existence. San Francisco's first mask ordering began in October and ended in November after the Armistice Day celebration. Some headlines: police raid saloons in war on influenza. Keep church windows open. Draft men to be first inoculated for the flu. Flu curfew to sound for city on Saturday night. Open-faced sneezers to be arrested. If you sneeze, they could arrest you back in those days. In San Francisco, you're under arrest. There you go. There they go. In San Francisco, the penalty for maskless violators was $5, $103 today, to $10, which would be $206 today, or 10 days in prison. On November 9th, 1,000 people were arrested. San Francisco Chronicle reported that the city's prison swelled to standing room only. Police shifts and court sessions were added to manage the problem. As bars and saloons and restaurants and theaters and schools closed, masks became a scapegoat. a symbol of government overreach, inspiring protests, petitions, and defiant barefaced gatherings. All the while, thousands of Americans were dying in the deadly pandemic. Well, while this is going on, Tsar Nicholas II is killed in Russia. I went to high school in 1970. I was in 10th grade, 70, 71, and the book Nicholas and Alexandria came out, and then the movie came out, and poor unfortunate me had to read that stupid book called Nicholas and Alexandria, and then we had to see the movie and do a report on it. And I had no interest in that. Not after what my family told me about the Tsar, and they had problems living in Russia. So why would I care about Nicholas and Alexandria? Except I had to because the teacher said I had to. I really didn't. November 1917, the Bolshevik revolutionaries, led by Vladimir Lenin, took over the Russian government. Nicholas II tried to convince the British and the French, give me asylum. My wife is the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. But both countries refused, and the Romanovs found themselves in the hands of the newly formed revolutionary government. Both Nicholas and Empress Alexandra were in denial. They never gave up hope. They thought they were going to be saved. They were shuffled from house to house. Finally, they were imprisoned in a home that the Bolsheviks called the House of Special Purpose. And this was a house of special purpose. On July 17th, the Romanovs were awoken and told, get ready for another move. Still hoping to escape, the women packed up their things, put clothing into, basically, put on clothing in which they had sewn their jewelry, religious icons, and a large amount of money. Unexpectedly, their captors turned on them, attacking them with bullets and the butts of their guns and bayonets in their own hands and fists and heels of their feet. All 7 of the Romanovs were dead, and that ends the Russian monarchy. Prohibition and Carrie Nation. There's a bar in Boston, about 2 blocks from the State House, called Carrie Nation. Why is it called Carrie Nation? It's a joke, because Carrie Nation took a hatchet wherever she went to a saloon and busted up the saloon. In Boston, Carrie Nation was Boston's first speakeasy. In 1826, the first of the Temperance Societies, the American Temperance Society, is formed. It had some success, but it wasn't until the proliferation of saloons after the Civil War that the temperance movement gained traction. There's Carrie Nation, and this is a cartoon. And all these women are standing in front of a saloon, and they're all upset. They want to close the saloon. They're upset because their husbands are in there drinking themselves into oblivion. And when they came out, they may have been so whacked out, they might have beaten up their wives. And that was no big deal, by the way, in the 19th century. Women being beaten up, no big deal. Men control us, no big deal. In 1873, the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, or Union, was founded, and the temperance movement got its most forceful voice. The history of the temperance movement and the history of the women's movement are linked, which explains why the WCTU originally proposed the ban of alcohol as a method for preventing abuse from alcoholic husbands. The WCTU spent many years building the movement through education and local and state laws, and in 1881 had a big success. Kansas banned alcohol in its constitution. There's a cartoonist depiction of Carrie Nation there, like this, with the hatchet and the barkeep behind the bar, cowering to Carrie Nation. It is about this time Carrie Nation comes into prominence, attacking saloons with a hatchet. Saloons maintained their popularity through the Progressive era, except it was waning toward the end of the Progressive era, which is World War I, when hostility towards saloons became widespread. The push for prohibition gained momentum with women in Protestant congregations leading the way. During World War I, there was a temporary prohibition on alcohol production. There was a pronounced anti-German sentiment pushed by the Anti-Saloon League, and many brewers were German, and often the loudest opponents of prohibition. The temporary situation dealt a serious blow to the anti-prohibition forces. The support on the ban of alcohol increased, including in New York. Close the saloons if you believe that traffic in alcohol does more harm than good. Help stop it. Strengthen the America campaign, 145 East 22nd Street, New York, New York. On December 18, 1917, a constitutional amendment to prohibit alcohol was proposed in the Senate. In October, Congress passed the Volstead Act, National Prohibition Act, which was the enabling legislation that set the rules down for enforcing the ban on alcohol and defined the types of alcoholic beverages to be prohibited. It goes out to the 48 states for a vote. And there are all kinds of protests for and against prohibition. This particular one, vote dry. Vote dry. Let's not have alcohol. Except there's a little problem with that. The prohibition movement wanted to rid American society of the tyranny of the drink. But farmers that grew fruit retained the ability to produce hard cider and whiskey and wine. The wine would be available for your local doctor to give you. If you have a toothache, you drink that. Maybe it'll kill the pain. Or religious purposes. Hey, here's another one. Hey, Sammy, how about two more? You know, we don't have any at home. Well, you can go to wherever you practice your religion and get some booze. Women's suffrage. Women's suffrage. On the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration in 1913, protesters staged a massive suffrage parade in the nation's capital, and hundreds of women were injured in confrontations with police. The police beat up the women. Not only did the police beat up the women, but passers-by watching this protest decided, yeah, let's get in there. Let's beat up the women because they don't deserve the right to vote. By the way, no arrests were made of anybody beating up the women. That same year, Alice Paul founded the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, which later became the National Women's Party. That is Alice Paul. The organization staged numerous demonstrations and regularly picketed the White House, among other militant tactics. As a result of these actions, some of the group members arrested, like Alice Paul, who went on a hunger strike, and when she was arrested in 1917, and people tried to feed her, and then they said, she's crazy, she's crazy. And that's how they basically, New York Times also said these women were basically silly women. This is in 1917. Silly women doing all these silly things for the vote. New York Times, 1917. And they did serve jail time. But a couple things would change. One, Carrie Chapman Catt would become the leader of the women's movement, and also the men are off. Fight the war. Women have to prove themselves. And guess what? The women were able to do the jobs of the men. And because the women did the jobs of the men and did well, how could you deny them the right to vote? 1918, Wilson switched his stance on women's voting rights, thanks to Carrie Chapman Catt, and also the fact that they worked, and he proposed a women's right to vote amendment after America's involvement in World War I started, and the increased role that women played in American society working. When the amendment came up for a vote, Wilson addressed the Senate in favor of suffrage. As reported in the New York Times on October 1st, Wilson said, I regard the extension of suffrage to women as essential, vitally essential, to the successful prosecution of the great war of humanity in which we are engaged. Some women in England did get the right to vote. The United Kingdom begins granting voting rights to some women with the passage of the Representation of People Act on February 6th. The law granted limited voting rights to women, allowing women over the age of 30 who are property owners or married to property owners the right to vote. It was also known as the Fourth Reform Act. and it expanded voting rights for men as well, removing property restrictions. The law tripled the size of Britain's electorate from 7 million people to about 21 million people. And also in the UK, women could run for office. They could run for office. On November 21st, the Parliament Qualification of Women Act, 1918, an act of Parliament of the United Kingdom is passed. It gave women over the age of 21 the right to stand for election as a member of Parliament. In the November 14th election to the House of Commons, 17 women candidates ran. The only woman elected was Sinn Féin candidate for Dublin St. Patrick's, Constance Markievicz. However, in line with her political philosophy, she did not take her seat. Okay, this is the Suicide Club in the United States. Charles Lindbergh came out of these guys. United States Airmail. On May 15th, the United States officially established its airmail service with inaugural flights between Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and New York City. Army planes and pilots were used on the first flights. 3 months later, the Post Office Department took over airmail operations with planes and civilian pilots of its own. Neither snow, nor rain, nor fog, nor winds, nor torrential rains were expected to delay them in the swift completion of their flights. This attitude did little to improve the image of the airmail service, which at the time was considered little more than a suicide club for flyers. Okay, if you have this stamp, I want to talk to you because you could hire me to do something. This stamp, only about 100 of these around. It's called the Flying Jenny, or the inverted Flying Jenny mistake, and it's on 24-cent airmail stamps. The inverted Jenny is a misprinted U.S. postage stamp showing an inverted image of a blue airplane. The error occurred on the 24-cent, $5.37 today, airmail stamp. Only one sheet of 100 inverted stamps was sold. No other examples have been discovered. The inverted Jenny depicts a biplane known as the Curtiss JN or the Jenny. But in part of the rush to print the stamps, the plane was accidentally printed upside down. That is what the stamp was supposed to look like. If you have it, one sheet of 100 misprinted stamps went public. The value not immediately apparent. A clerk bought it for face value, 24 bucks, or $537 today. Tarzan of the Apes. How many of you seen the Tarzan movies? Watched it on TV, listened on radio, or maybe play a video game with Tarzan or read the book Tarzan? Tarzan of the Apes is an action adventure silent film directed by Scott Sidney, starring Elmo Lincoln, Enid Market, George B. French, and Gordon Griffin. It was the first Tarzan film ever made, based on Edgar Rice Burroughs' original 1912 novel, Tarzan of the Apes. Tarzan of the Apes was the highest grossing film in the United States in 1918, bringing in about $1.5 million, which would be about $30 million today. The legacy. Well, these are the four guys who were supposed to carve up Europe. Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Clemenceau of France, Orlando of Italy, and David Lloyd George of England. They were the guys who were supposed to bring the peace. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points never really took off. Wilson's idea for the League of Nations did materialize, but the United States never joined the group. The United States never signed off on the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. World War I would not end until 1923, the Treaty of Versailles. In terms of why did the Germans lose? Well, if you look at that, it's called the stab in the back. And the Germans blame the Jews and communists for losing the war. Erich Ludendorff was among the many who portrayed Germany's new civilian government as responsible for Germany's defeat, not his leadership. Almost immediately, Ludendorff began to proclaim in speeches, books, and articles the myth the big lie of stab in the back. He argued that the Germans had not been militarily defeated, but rather been sabotaged by liberals, communists, war profiteers, and Jews on the home front. In this way, he sought to avoid his own responsibility for the defeat. Now, there's a former Austrian citizen who was a German soldier who bought into the big lie, who bought into the big myth. His name, Adolf Hitler. Ludendorff was part of the 1923 beer hall push in Munich, where Hitler and the Nazis tried to overthrow the German government. Now, Ludendorff is there, but if you saw a movie a few years ago called Wonder Woman, Ludendorff is in that movie. He is in that movie. In the 2017 movie, Wonder Woman, Danny Hudson's villainous General Ludendorff was named after the German general Erich Ludendorff. Anyway, it's over. It's over. Armistice Day no longer exists in the United States. In 1954, after World War II had required the greatest mobilization of soldiers and sailors, Marines, airmen in the history of the United States, the Congress decided it's no longer Armistice Day. We're going to honor all veterans. The 83rd Congress of the United States, at the urging of the Veteran Service Organizations, amended the Act of 1938 by striking the word armistice and inserting in its place veterans. With the approval of this legislation, Public Law 380 on June 1st, 1954, November 11th, became known as Veterans Day to honor all of the people who served in the war, like you. You got your Korean hat on. So, anyway, like you. Another dead body there from the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-19 was the deadliest pandemic in world history. 500 million people got the flu. About 1/3 of the population, 500 million people, causing up to 50 million deaths, including 675,000 deaths in the United States alone. That is Nevada. On this side is Arizona. At this time of the year, even though they border each other at Hoover Dam, Arizona never turned the clock back. Nevada did. So it's a 2-hour time difference now until they turn the clock ahead between East and Arizona, Eastern time in Arizona, until March when the clock goes forward. Nearly 2/3 of Americans said that they were in favor of ending the clock changes, according to the Economist YouGov poll of 1,000 adults in March 2023. Of those who favored ending the time change, half of them said they favored year-round daylight savings time, which means that today the sun goes down at about 4:45. If we had year-round daylight savings time here in Connecticut, it would go down at 5:45. But on the other hand, in the dead of winter, the clock, or rather the daylight, would start at about 8:30 in the morning around here. So that's the difference. Anyway, half said they favored daylight savings time as opposed to 31% who said stay on standard time. By the way, if you stay on standard time, it gets dark in this area about 7:30, and it gets light about 4:10 in the morning. So I'm not sure if you want that either. Federal law currently prevents states from unilaterally, well, they can't make daylight saving time permanent. However, 19 states have enacted legislation or passed resolutions to green light permanent daylight savings time if Congress approved the change according to the National Conference of State Legislatures. That's Eugene V. Debs. He ran for president in 1920, convict, 9653. That's how he ran, as convict 9653. On November 2nd, Debs received about 1 million votes in the U.S. presidential election on the Socialist Party ticket while in prison. He was serving a 10-year prison term for that speech in Canton, Ohio, protesting World War I, which was raging in Europe. Debs was arrested and convicted in federal court under the Espionage Act of 1917. Just before Christmas, 1921, Warren G. Harding, the President of the United States, commuted Debs's sentence. The legacy, drink, drink, drink. Prohibition and most women having the right to vote became constitutional amendments in 1920. Prohibition ended in 1933. Not all American women got the right to vote in 1920. Native American women were not allowed to be United States citizens, so they couldn't vote. With the passage of the Snyder Act in 1924, American-born Native women gained citizenship. As late as 1962, individual states still prevented some women from voting by the use of literacy tests, poll tax, and claims that residence on a reservation was not meant. One was not a resident of the state. Native-born Asian Americans had citizenship in 1920, but first-generation Asian Americans did not. Asian American immigrant women were therefore excluded from voting until Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 allowed them to gain citizenship more than 3 decades after the 19th Amendment. The poll tax was eliminated in 1964. Women in England, Wales, and Scotland received the right to vote in 1928 as part of the Representation of the People Act. Make sure they're over the age of 21, no property restrictions. That is George M. Cohan. And that is Times Square. In 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt awarded George M. Cohan a Special Medal of Honor for his contribution to the cause of World War I. Babe Ruth was traded to the New York Yankees in 1920. He became the greatest home run hitter of all time. Tarzan remains relevant in culture. There are movies, radio series, television shows, Tarzan video games, and comic books. The Star-Spangled Banner became the national anthem in 1931. And, well, how much are these stamps worth today? Want to guess?
$1 million.
You say $1 million. Do I hear higher, 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 higher?
$2 million.
On November 15, 2023, the inverted Flying Jenny stamp was put under the hammer by Robert A. Siegel Auction Galleries. The record price, or the price became a record for the stamp, $2,006,000. The buyer, Charles Hack, was 76 years old, a real estate developer and investor. He could not buy it in 2018, but he told the Washington Post this time he was willing to go for a higher price for a pristine stamp. This is the premium copy. It does not get any better than this. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? Your turn to talk.